Thank you very much for inviting me to give this talk. And I'm as somebody who read Rachel Carson, I think, in my postgraduate years for the first time. It's an honor to come and give this lecture. And I'd like to kick off with a quote from Rachel Carson about, let's start this talk by contemplating the earth and its beauties, because it always results in a sense of wonder and humility. So if we contemplate this planet, I think one of the most profound realizations of the last century is that our planet is not only a place where life exists, the only place we know in the universe so far where life exists, but it's also a planet that is actively shaped by life. And much of the atmosphere, the geological functions, etc., are actually actively shaped by the presence of life on this planet. And this was captured in the early 20th century by the great the pioneering Russian scientist Vladimir Vernadsky in his book, The Biosphere, where he came up with this concept, or defined this concept of the biosphere as this planetary membrane for capturing and storing and transforming solar energy. And so much of our thinking of the biosphere, so I'm just hiding a panel here, much of our thinking of the functioning of the biosphere has evolved over the 20th century, and it thinks about the role that vegetation in particular plays in receiving energy from the sun and capturing and transforming that energy. But I think of the biosphere is still only partial in our concept. And what is missing often in our conceptualization of the biosphere at this planetary scale is the role that animals can play in this transformation of energy and the use of energy. So our Earth system science is still predominantly, in terms of the biosphere, a science of plants and vegetation, and very little of it is a science related to the other complex elements of a living planet, and in particular animals I'll focus on here. And so what I want to do in this talk is explore the potential of ecological energetics as a way of modifying our understanding of the biosphere to incorporate a wider and richer understanding going beyond vegetation. And to quote to bring another quote from Rachel Carson, "A living cell, like a flame, burns to produce the energy on which life depends. And all of these billions of gently burning little fires spark the energy of life." And so life is unified by this metabolic use of energy. Any organism on the planet, from a fungus to a bacterium to an elephant to a tree, all of them have metabolic energy, transforming captured sunshine and using it to perform the various functions of life. And so energy is a powerful tool in ecology because it's a physically meaningful unit. It's something that's real in the world. It's not some arbitrary index that we've made up. And that can be applied across all taxa and unify our understanding of ecology. And the physicist's definition of energy is the ability to do work. And so the amount of energy flowing through a particular taxon or through a particular ecological function can be a measure of the intensity of that function. And when it comes to vegetation, we have a fairly good idea of the metabolism of the planet. And for this talk, I'll focus on the terrestrial biosphere, while recognizing there is a marine biosphere that's almost as large in size and just as important. But because of my own speciality, and perhaps because our data is richer, I'll focus in particular on the functioning of the terrestrial biosphere. So we have a fairly good idea of how much energy is captured through photosynthesis, through field studies and satellite remote sensing. And we can produce these sorts of maps. That on the right, there's a scale in the more common units of grams of carbon being captured through photosynthesis, but we can convert carbon into joules of energy in a quite straightforward fashion through the basic reactions of photosynthesis. And so about 150 terawatts of energy are captured, of sunshine are captured by the terrestrial biosphere. So these figures are one way of looking at that. Another way is through this sort of diagram, which is called a cartogram. Now, and one of the advantages of being in the geography department is that I'm surrounded by people who think about maps quite a lot. And a few years ago, we came up with this way of representing the image that we saw in the previous slide. But here now, the size of each pixel represents the amount of biological energy through photosynthesis going through that particular pixel. And if you average over the year, you get a diagram like this. And you see the tropics are swollen, much more biological activity going through tropical regions, and the deserts like the Sahara or Central Asia or part of Australia are shriveled away. If you do this for the month of January, you see in particular the Northern Hemisphere is largely shut down. And we really, in terms of the terrestrial biosphere, we really are living on a tropical planet. That's where most of the energetic activity of life on Earth is occurring in the Northern Hemisphere winter months. If we go to July, we see that there has been this great greening of the Northern Hemisphere, and you see a map that starts looking a bit more familiar in terms of a global map. But the tropics still significant, but also lots of biological activity going on in higher latitudes. And if we do this for every month of the year, you get this cycle that shows the great green heartbeat of the terrestrial biosphere, the pulsing of energy, the capture of energy by tropical regions and non-tropical regions, of that cycling of that captured energy over the seasons. So what I've described there is, in some ways, it's more plant physiology than ecology. It's about how plants function and how they capture energy overall. And the realm of ecology is more the realm of interactions between taxa and species, and how this energy then spills away from the plants into other taxa and other trophic levels. And so this is the remit of what I would think of as ecology, the science of interactions between living organisms. So what I'm going to do now is show how we quantify some of these elements in some case studies. I'll draw some examples from a woodland just outside of Oxford here called Whiteham Woods, which has been foundational in a lot of ecological work since the early work of Charles Elton in the 1920s and 1930s, and really was one of the core sites where the idea of food webs was developed, along with many other ideas in ecology. And I'll compare it to another of our field sites, which is in Borneo, in tropical Southeast Asia, which contains these magnificent dipterocarp forests, some of the most magnificent forests on Earth in terms of stature. And over the last 15 years or so, my lab has been developing a method for quantifying in a standardized way the productivity of ecosystems across the tropics. We would call this the Global Ecosystems Monitoring Network, or GEM. And the sites now that are over 60 or 70 sites across the tropics where we've applied a standard methodology to quantify the production of leaves, of flowers, of fruits, of roots, of wood, and the metabolism of vegetation. And that's not a main focus of my talk today, but just to briefly describe it, these are the sorts of diagrams that we get. This is for our site in Whiteham Woods, just outside of Oxford. And you see we can quantify the flow of carbon, which is equivalent to the flow of energy through the vegetation in this ecosystem. So the top, we have the GPP, the gross primary production. In this case, it's about 23 megagrams or tons of carbon per hectare per year. About a third of that ends up producing biomass, which we call net primary production. The other 2/3 are used by the metabolism of the plants themselves and is released. The carbon is released by respiration, by the leaves, the wood, the root tissue in the vegetation. And then all of that living biomass ends up being dead biomass and then being decomposed predominantly by microbes, but also to a smaller extent by detritivores and other taxa. And so we can quantify this, what's happening in the vegetation quite well. And here's a comparison of two different sites, or three sites, an old growth and a logged forest in Borneo, and this UK site just outside of Oxford. And in terms of the total amount of sunshine falling onto this ecosystem, you see there's about twice as much falling over the year in the tropics as there is in the UK. On a day like this, when it's cloudy and rainy outside, I could feel that the deficit in sunshine for sure here. If you look at we can quantify the total photosynthesis in these ecosystems, and we see that in all of these systems, it's around 2 to 2.5% of that captured, of that sunshine is captured and turned into biological energy. In fact, a bit more is done in the UK system than in the biodiverse tropical forest. So the biodiversity of the tropical forests doesn't improve its photosynthetic capture ability. The tropics have more productivity simply because there's a lot more sunshine available in a 12-month growing season as well than in the shorter growing season and less sunshine at the higher latitudes. But then once we've captured that sunshine, we can explore how much of it goes to produce biomass. And you can see it's around 40% goes into producing leaves or wood or roots, and the rest is used in the metabolism of the vegetation itself. And so going beyond the plants, we want to understand how much of this captured sunshine, this energy, spills out beyond the plants into higher trophic levels. And this has a fairly long history. This is the science of ecological energetics, and it was pioneered by Lindemann in the 1940s, who pioneered this idea of thinking about ecosystems as flows of energy and nutrients. In the 50s and 60s, Howard Odum and Eugene Odum started these types of descriptions of ecosystems. Silver Springs is a key study site where this was done, but a range of other sites were done. But we started having this energetic description of the functioning of ecosystems. And there was a lot of this ecosystem energetic ecology going on in the 60s and in the early 70s. And then it seemed to diminish greatly in the late 70s onwards. And I'm not fully sure why. I've talked to a few ecologists, and I think to some extent there was a bit of a so what moment. If we can make these emerging energy diagrams, so what does that tell us practically about what to do with these ecosystems and how we should view these ecosystems? And also perhaps other areas of ecology, like population ecology, were greatly advanced and became more seductive. So there was a bit of a move away from this energetics approach to ecology from the late 70s onwards. And I'd like to argue it's a time to come back into energetics. It has much to offer our ecological understanding of the world. So how do we calculate energy uptake by animals? Now, one way would be to sit there and watch every leaf being consumed by animals and quantify that activity directly. That is possible in some cases in terms of insects, for example. That is the way we would do this. We would look at what fraction of leaves are consumed by insects and estimate insect herbivory in that way. But that's not possible for many animals. And so we approach this problem indirectly by using the relationship between the body mass of an animal and its energy requirements. And broadly, for any one type of animal, in this case mammals, there's a relationship between body mass and the energetic expenditure. The larger an animal, the more energy it consumes, but the relationship isn't simply isometric or linear. Large animals consume less energy per unit mass than small animals overall. So a kilogram of elephant uses less energy than a kilogram of human or a kilogram of mice. And so there is a general law, and on logarithmic scales, it's approximately a straight line with a slope of approximately 3/4. And there's a whole realm of ecology, the science of metabolic ecology, that tries to explain why this slope is 3/4 and what are the fundamental rules of life that determine this slope. But we don't need to know the detail of that. We need to just simply use that equation that empirically exists. So if we know for an animal, in this case a European badger, the mass of that animal, we can estimate from that equation its energy expenditure. And then if we know something about the diet of that animal from experts, we can then estimate how much food is needed. And for each dietary element, there's a different assimilation efficiency. So animals or arthropods or fruits are relatively efficient to assimilate. Eating leaves is less efficient. There's much less nutrient content in leaves, much more unpalatable material. And so we can look up tables of assimilation efficiency. So you can see, for example, in most cases, the assimilation efficiency is around 80%. So 80% of the food that's ingested ends up being absorbed by the body and only about 20% being defecated. But if you look at things such as leaves, the efficiency is more like 32%. So the consuming leaves is much, much less efficient. And so if we know those efficiencies, from lookup tables, from literature, then we can estimate the total food intake required by that animal per day. And then we need to know something about the population of animals. And probably the most important variable is the population density, how many animals per unit area. And in this case, it's about 20 badgers per 18 hectares or 1.1 badgers per hectare. We might need to know something about the behavior. How much of the time are the animals feeding outside of your ecosystem of interest? They move around. How many months of the year are they active? Maybe they're hibernating. Maybe they migrate and are only in your ecosystem for part of the year. But once you bring in those factors, we can calculate the amount of energy flowing through consumption into this population of badgers. And so in this case, around 120 kilojoules per square meter per year. So we need to know a range of information, but the most critical information we need to know is the population density of that animal. The other things are bits that we can get from experts or from the literature to inform our estimates. And so now I'm going to turn and apply this approach to a rainforest in Borneo to understand how much energy is flowing. And I'm going to focus on birds and mammals only, recognizing that a lot of energy flows through other taxa, and particularly through invertebrates. But we have much poorer data, much poorer understanding of those energy flows. And whereas our data for birds and mammals is much stronger, and we can see some interesting patterns there that can tell us something about wider energy flows. So, as I said, these forests in Borneo are magnificent. Typical mean canopy height around 40 meters. The tallest broadleaf trees in the world have recently been discovered in Borneo, approaching about 100 meters in height. So these are amazing rainforests. Many of these rainforests, however, have been logged, and in many cases, quite heavily logged, particularly over the last half century. And what I want to explore is this comparison between these logged forests and these old growth forests. These logged forests, they're not clear cut, as you might see in, say, North American forests. In tropical forests, there are only a few commercial timber species. So what logging does is normally involves just taking out those commercial species, but also causing a lot of collateral damage to the wider forest structure. So these forests are often termed degraded forests. And I want to explore this term degraded, which is quite widely used in both in ecology and more widely in policy around the environment. And labeling an ecosystem degraded can have some benefits if that encourages the conservation or restoration of ecosystems. But in many cases, degradation is assigning a value to a system and saying this is somehow of lesser value. It's been spoiled, it's ruined compared to the pristine ecosystems. And therefore, if we're going to convert an ecosystem, maybe these degraded ones are where we focus on our conversion to oil palm plantations or agriculture. Well, let's focus our primary attention on the pristine system. So degradation can often be a gateway to lower value of an ecosystem and therefore further loss of that ecosystem. And I want to explore how valid this concept is in ecological terms, using this framing of energy flow. And so in terms of biomass, these forests are certainly degraded. This is a LiDAR image of old growth forests on the left and these heavily logged forests on the right. And you can see from the laser bounces from aircraft that these forests are 60 meters tall, absolutely fantastic canopies in these old growth systems. And once they're logged, much lower canopies, much lower biomass, much denser biomass near the ground as well, as you can see in these scatters. So in terms of structure, these systems are undoubtedly degraded. But how are they in terms of ecological function? And I'd like to use the concept of energy flow to explore this question. So in terms of what the vegetation is doing, in terms of primary production, the logged forest is as productive or even slightly more productive than the old growth forest. So the disturbance stimulates more rapid growth, trees are growing faster, they're investing much more in woods as they're racing towards the light and the new gaps that are created. And even an oil palm, it can be more productive, although in that case, that's channeled towards the canopy and the fruit production in the canopy. But the logged forest itself is as productive or slightly more productive than the old growth forest. And so how much of this energy captured by the vegetation ends up going through key vertebrates? So I'm going to focus on the birds and mammals where we have really rich data. And we have rich data because of work by some of my colleagues at the University of Kent, Matt Strubig and his team, who in this landscape collected a huge amount of data on mammal densities, bird densities, and there's a wider range of studies also looking at some of the species such as orangutans and elephants. So it's one of the richest sites of the tropics for our understanding of the population densities of birds and mammals together. So using the approach that I described earlier, in terms of turning those population densities into energy flow, we could do that for each individual species of bird and mammal, and then we can sum up over all the birds or over all the mammals and see how much energy is flowing through those groups. And this is where our first surprise emerged in this study. Before doing this work, I expected that energy flow in birds and mammals would be maintained in the logged forest. It would be similar to what was found in the old growth, and then it would collapse in the oil palm plantation. And what we found instead is that the energy flows were much higher, around 2.5 times higher in the logged forest compared to the old growth forest. And that was true both for birds on the left and for mammals on the right. And then they did collapse in the oil palm, particularly so for mammals. And we could group the birds and mammals according to their diets, and we could see which type of diet in particular there was more energy flow through. And they were all increased, but particularly in the insectivores in the birds, this yellow part of the bar here was particularly important in that increase, as well as the frugivores in pink. So there's more energy flowing through the logged forest than the old growth forest. There's also more energy flowing through the birds, about twice as much flowing through birds than through mammals, which I'll come back to later. But so there's more energy flow, but is that really a measure of ecological health? If a few generalist species are taking over, adapted to the disturbance, there's more energy flow, but we could still describe the system as ecologically degraded if it's lost a lot of the diversity of species and energy flow that it had in the old growth forest. But when we look at this, we find no decline in total numbers of species. These are these S numbers that we see here. The size of the circle is the amount of energy flow through each of these groups. S is the number of species. E is another measure of how the energy flow is spread across species. And what we do see is no decline in the number of species. In the logged forest is 37 here compared to 28 in the old growth. In many cases, an increase in species that are involved. So we're not seeing a loss of species in this shift from old growth to logged forest. But is there a turnover of species? Are we finding that those species that are specialist to the old growth system are losing out, and other species that, like the logged forest, are winning overall? There's an interesting paper that came out a few weeks ago that looked at this in the context of Germany, but looks at how disturbance tends to cause the traits of an ecosystem to change from slow, conservative traits to rapid ecosystem traits, and that applies across invertebrates, across birds and mammals, as a general pattern around disturbance. So we could be seeing a shift in turnover to things that just are adapted to this more dynamic disturbed state. In this particular case, this is not what we see. So what this figure shows is how much the energy flow through particular species changed in the logged forest compared to the old growth forest. And I'm just showing the top 20 and the bottom 20 of a long list here. And what you see is that the real winners in terms of energy flow are things like the big herbivores like deer and elephants and some of the common species like bulbuls. But there are very few species that lose out significantly. Only 2 species of mammal, the mouse deer and the spiny rat, do. And also, if you look at the top 20, below that top 20, there are lots of other species that are still positive. You can see that these arrows are still fairly positive at number 20, and there are very few species that are substantially negative. So overall, most old growth species seem to have more energy flowing through them in the logged forest. So there are very few. In terms of birds and mammals, I should emphasize this doesn't capture other species, but in terms of birds and mammals, there are very few losers in this logged forest. And so why are these forests having such amplified energetics? It's because the plant community is shifting from a very conservative state. So an old growth forest is one where the vegetation is not competing so much for light, but is prioritizing chemical defense against herbivory, the intense pressures for what plants have of being eaten. And so in an old growth forest, there's much more investment in chemical defenses. The leaves are not very palatable. As a forest is disturbed and logged, the plants prioritize chemical defense less, prioritize growth more, and therefore those leaves become much more edible, much less defended. And that causes a surge in arthropod herbivores, but also there's more energy near the ground, more palatable food near the ground. So the large herbivores, the elephants, the deer, etc., also surge in abundance. And so overall, the forest becomes more edible, more salad-like, and that supports the surge of energy into higher trophic levels. And so that tells us the story of this particular context. So when we see these old growth forests, what we're seeing is a site of intense chemical warfare between vegetation and herbivores. And that pattern is disrupted when a system is disturbed. And that shows you one of the insights that this energetic approach can give us. This is something that we've known in ecology for a while. It's often termed the intermediate disturbance hypothesis, that some levels of disturbance can enhance some ecological functions. But what energy flow does is give us a quantified way of thinking about this shift in ecosystem function. So is this finding generalizable across the tropics? Probably, but we don't know the degree to which this is generalizable. And that's because these forests in Southeast Asia are particularly untasty. The dipterocarp trees that dominate them are particularly inedible. The leaves are full of terpenes that make them not very tasty to invertebrates. They are seed dispersed forests, so there's very few fruits for animals, and also that they are masting. They produce these seeds every few years, so these are quite hungry forests for many animals. And so when these forests are logged, and particularly when those dipterocarp trees are taken out, the palatability of these forests increases substantially. And so this effect may be larger in these forests than in other tropical forests. And we need to do studies elsewhere to be more sure of how generalizable these findings are. But to conclude on this part of the work, this energetics approach shows how thinking about energy flow through ecosystems can change our understanding of how what ecological function is. And it can show us sometimes the disparity between the concept of degradation applied purely to biomass or to carbon stocks increasingly that occurs for ecosystems, and degradation in terms of ecological functions. And sometimes the carbon story, the biomass story, runs counter to the ecological story. So I want to be cautious here. What I'm not advocating here is that we should go ahead and log remaining old growth forests to somehow improve their ecological functioning. There's lots of unique functions in old growth systems, and they need to be protected and enhanced in protection. But it does, what I want to do is question the too easy application of this concept of degradation to human altered systems. And actually many ecological functions are vibrant. And when we're thinking of preserving an intact and functional biosphere, our attention it mustn't only be on conservation on the most intact, most pristine systems, but think more widely around these modified ecosystems, this modified biosphere, and all those functions that it can still provide. And this applies, in that particular example that I showed was around logging, but this example applies to many other human modified systems. So this is an example of a smallholder farm in Nigeria. And in some ways, this system is degraded. There's a loss of biomass, there's alteration of vegetation. But in many other ways, these smallholder traditional systems are full of ecological function. And lots of energy flow, lots of species thriving in these human modified systems as well. So it's important to recognize that, to have this more holistic understanding of what a functioning biosphere is in modern times. And so when we compare different ecosystems, there's something we're just beginning to do in this energetic framework. There are also surprises in store. So let's have a quick look at comparing Wytham Woods, this UK system, with this tropical rainforest in Borneo. And this is the amount of energy, the fraction of the primary production going through mammals in the tropical rainforest on the left and the UK forest on the right. And in the tropical rainforest is around 0.5 to 1%. In the UK forest, it's around 9%. A lot of that is linked to a hyperabundance of deer. If you discount that and take out a lot of the deer, it's more like 4 or 5%. But it's interesting that there's such a striking difference. And if we look at birds, we see the opposite story. Much more energy flowing through birds in the tropics, much less flowing through birds in this UK system. And why this difference? What determines the energetic partitioning between birds and mammals across the biosphere? And the answer is we don't really know. There hasn't been enough comparative work to think about this, or even realization of these patterns. And this is, again, another area where I think energy flow can help us think through these ideas. I suspect a big part of this is to do with climate. I think winter is a much stronger filter on birds than it is on mammals, and that really greatly diminishes bird populations, and it doesn't to the same extent affect mammal populations. But we really need more studies, more comparative work to understand what determines these patterns across the planet overall, not only for birds and mammals, but for many other taxa as well. And so if we look at the total consumption of NPP in birds and mammals, we see this pattern that in a tropical rainforest, around 1% of that captured sunshine ends up flowing through birds and mammals. In a UK woodland is around 3%. So there are quite substantial differences in how much energy is cascading through the system from sunshine to plants to birds and mammals. And a lot more to find out. So a lot of what I've described thus far has been about energy flow. And yet earlier on in my talk, I talked about the importance of energy flow for ecological function. So how do we connect energy to function? And I'd like to spend the last 10 minutes or so showing an example of how we do this, and also how we do this at a larger scale. And in this case, the context of sub-Saharan Africa. And there are many metrics now for biodiversity, for planetary maps of species richness. One metric that's quite widely applied now is this idea of biodiversity intactness, which is how much the abundance of key populations of species have declined from their intact reference point, which is often the value that's found in intact nature reserves, and is somehow taken often as an example of what things would have been like in pre-industrial area around 1800 or so. So this is the map of biodiversity intactness, the intactness of the abundance of species. But what does this tell us about ecological functioning? The biodiversity intactness is something that has been applied to this planetary boundaries framework, where there's an interest in understanding the global boundaries beyond which human activities must not spill because of the risk of undermining global planetary function. And there's been a lot of work trying to understand is there a planetary boundary in biodiversity? What does it mean? Is it a useful concept? And how do we measure it? And biodiversity intactness has been proposed as a measure of this. But also more recently, it's been abandoned in recent work. And the reason it was abandoned is because there was no directly relevant link between biodiversity intactness, the amount of animals or species, and ecosystem function. And I'd like to argue that energy provides a way of connecting species and species abundance to planetary functions. And I'd like to show that to you in the next few slides. So recently, recent work has produced this more rich biodiversity intactness map for sub-Saharan Africa based on local expertise knowledge. And so we have a rich understanding of the intactness of regions, and particularly of sub-Saharan Africa in this case. As you can see, high values in many areas, low values in areas such as parts of West Africa and East Africa in particular. And using the same approach that I described earlier on, we're now doing it to the ranges of species across sub-Saharan Africa. We can calculate the amount of energy flowing through a reference landscape of full biodiversity intactness for sub-Saharan Africa, and also for the actual landscape now with croplands and various land uses across sub-Saharan Africa. And when we do this calculation, we come up with maps such as this, which show the total energy flow through birds on the left and mammals on the right in this pre-industrial reference level at the top and in current landscapes at the bottom. And you can see even at the top, there's some really interesting patterns that we need to explore and understand in more detail. Why are there more birds and mammals flowing in East Africa, energy flow, than in West Africa? Is that linked to the more volcanic nature of East Africa that provides more nutrients, provides more productivity that can support this? Things that we need to explore. But we also see that there's been a decline in the energy flow that we estimate to be by about a third. So the energy flow is about 64% of baseline values. And we can do this and compare different ecosystems. If we can look at forests in Africa, the outer circle shows the energy flow in intact forests, the inner circle, the flow currently on average through those forests. And we see a collapse in large terrestrial herbivores in the bottom left, a decline in frugivores. Other things, the small terrestrial herbivores seem to be more robust overall. If we compare that to the study I showed earlier from Borneo, we see some intriguing differences. Much more frugivory in an African forest because there are many more fruits available, whereas they simply aren't available in Southeast Asian forests. So you can see the interesting biogeography of the tropics coming through here. The fruit-rich forests of Africa support much more frugivorous animals than the fruit-poor forests of Southeast Asia. So biogeography will show some interesting patterns as we explore this further. We can do this for grassy ecosystems like savannas. Again, you see a collapse of the large herbivores, how important they were, how much less important they are now, and more robustness in other terms. We can do it for arid systems, and there's still some large error bars here, so I'm a little bit cautious on these numbers, but we see how the fossorial mammals, the mole rats, the burrowing mammals can be hugely important in arid ecosystems. And then once we've got the energy flow through each species, how do we go about converting that into ecological functions? Well, we can do that by assigning each species to particular functions. So if we're looking at pollination, which are the species that are significant pollinators? Let's lump them all together and get the energy flow through that, or insectivory, or scavenging, or other ecological functions. I emphasize that we're only looking at birds and mammals here. Clearly, for things like pollination, the invertebrates play a much more important role. But we can start at least see what role is played by birds and mammals for many of these functions. And some of these functions, such as browsing or nutrient dispersal, are dominated by bird and mammal functions. And so by doing that, we can see how much energy was flowing through those functions in historical times and how much is flowing through those functions now. And you can see, for example, here, a collapse in grazing and browsing, but more resilience in other functions such as soil formation or insectivory, collapse in nutrient dispersal as well. Things that are dependent on large animals are particularly showing a large decline in those functions. And they're right that we see that as a relative decline as well. And so that's in terms of energy flow. But once we've got this holistic energy approach, we can see to what extent does our existing biodiversity intactness metric capture that. Okay, do we need to go through the complexity of energy flow where if biodiversity intact is okay? And what we see in the case of birds overall, biodiversity intactness and energy flow are reasonably well correlated. And so biodiversity intactness is a fairly good proxy for ecological energy flow overall. And that's because there's a lot of redundancy in birds, many birds performing similar functions, many bird species performing similar functions. And also birds have a relatively small size range as well, between the smallest and the largest birds. For mammals, we see a much weaker relationship, much more scatter, and that's because of much less redundancy and also a much larger size range between small shrews and large elephants. So you don't, in biodiversity intactness, you need to know which species they are and what functions they provide to understand the ecological functions. Intactness overall is a poor proxy. Similar, if we look at species richness, we see that species richness for birds is a fairly good proxy for ecological functions. Species richness in animals is a very poor proxy for the same reasons. And that was overall. If we look at specific functions, the pattern can be consistent or it can break down. For things like insectivory by mammals, we see, again, a broad correlation between biodiversity intactness and ecological function. For things such as nutrient cycling, we see tight relationships but non-linear. A few species really matter. The large carnivores, the large herbivores are really important. So which species really matters. And for other ones like seed dispersal, there is a relationship, but it's a lot of scatter in that relationship because the range of body sizes involved, the range of functions involved. And if we look at sub-Saharan Africa as a whole, we can quantify the total amount of energy flowing through particular species. And in summary, what's striking is how a few types of species dominate. We estimate that around 8% of energy flow in the 18th century, the pre-modern energy flow was through elephants alone in sub-Saharan Africa. And also a similar amount through these pastoral animals such as mole rats as well. So it's surprising what animals dominated in terms of ecological functions. And again, energy can give us new insights into things, into ecosystems we think we understand and are familiar with. And so to conclude, energy flow has the promise to provide this mechanistic understanding of the health and functioning of ecosystems in the biosphere. But we shouldn't get carried away. I'm not advocating that energy flow is the only lens at which we look at function. It's dangerous to have any single metric, just as carbon itself can have some benefits as a metric, but also it can be dangerous to value ecosystems only for carbon. Energy flow just gives us a different lens for understanding ecological functions. It does provide us these integrated ecosystem level insights and also a few surprises, as I showed. And the unifying nature of energy provides a mechanistic way of bringing animals into and animal functions into global biosphere science, which is to date dominated by vegetation functions and where animal functions are largely invisible. So to conclude, going back to this living biosphere, Vernadsky talks about the capture and storage of energy and the transformation of energy. And I think there's much to be made of linking field ecology and the richness of species data, behavioral data, through to planetary function through this framing of energy flow. And I'd like to end with another quote from Rachel Carson, and I think thinking about when you're next to out in the woodland or any ecosystem, think about this cascade of energy from sunshine to vegetation to the different functions that weave and cascade through an ecosystem. And I think our understanding of ecosystems and also your appreciation of life on Earth can be enriched by thinking of life as energy. So thank you.
Well, thank you so very much, Professor Malhi, for your really fantastic lecture, very stimulating and insightful. Now it's time for questions. Again, the audience is welcome to post questions in the Q&A box. I saw a question already there. So the question is, how do you get biomass for wildlife, which are harder to capture and weigh?
Okay. Well, the biomass, for the work I've shown here, none of this has involved us directly measuring biomass. What we do is take biomass from the literature. And unfortunately, there are many dedicated ecologists around the world who have studied different taxa and weighed them overall. So I think for many things that, in principle, you can capture and weigh them. I suppose for the very largest animals, when you get to whales and marine systems, it becomes something that's estimated in other ways from the dimensions and the density. And then by knowing density and volume, you can estimate overall biomass. But overall, there's an abundant literature out there now of the biomass for most morphotypes or species, if not for individual species, then at least for that particular morphotype.
Great, thank you. So you mentioned a surprising result, more energy flow in logged forest than old growth forest. And so what kind of age of the logged forest? Let's say, are the newly logged forest or the old logged forest, or what are they, how old they have been logged, how many years they have been logged?
So these forests that we studied in Borneo had been through multiple rounds of logging over several decades. So the logging started in the 1980s and continued to the early 2000s. So the measurements we were doing probably around 10 years after the most recent logging. But there'd been several rounds of logging before that. So still some time after the last logging, but still these systems are very much still responding to those logging events overall.
Great, thank you. So there is another question in the chat. So thanks so much for your excellent lecture. Humans, of course, affect ecosystems in multiple ways, like forestry, climate change, invasive species. Has the energetic approach been used to compare and contrast the effects of these different human activities on ecosystem functions?
Okay, thank you. My answer to that would be not enough. And I won't claim to know about every study everywhere, but I'm struck by how little this approach has been used since the 60s and 70s to compare the effects that modification has on ecological function. So I guess what I'm advocating a little bit in this lecture is trying to take this approach, because what it does do is integrate species, bird data, mammal data, invertebrate data, vegetation data, and many studies that look at the effects of modification tend to focus on one particular group, whether it's on vegetation or on birds or whatever, but very little looks at overall ecological energy flow, ecological functions. So I think there's a huge area of potential research here in looking at that. And so certainly my group is beginning to look at that in the context of restoration and nature recovery. How does restoration affect energy flows? But also another one, some of our studies are interested in, is looking at how woody expansion, woody encroachment into grassland areas might be affecting energy flow as well as invasive species. We have a project on tropical islands looking at how the effects of invasive rats might have affected nutrient flows and energy flows in those systems.
Yeah, thank you so much. The next question is similar to the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. Do you see there is a tipping point in the degraded forest in terms of energy flow?
That's an interesting question. And again, I don't think we know the answer. These forests structurally are quite heavily logged. There's nothing reduced impact about the logging that we studied there. And yet we still saw quite enhanced energy flows. Ultimately, there has to be some, I'm not sure if tipping point is the right description, but there'll be some sort of peak value and then a further decline. So when we looked at the oil palm plantation, which is a further extreme of human modification, we saw a strong decline in energy flows. So at some point, there is a peak and then a decline in these functions. But I think we need to get out and understand the ecological metrics, the understand the system to understand where these thresholds might lie. I doubt it'll be a tipping point. I think it'll be more just an inflection point where we'll start seeing a decline in energy flow, unless you go to extreme modification, such as agricultural landscapes.
Great, thank you. The next question is excellent talk, Dr. Malhi. Thank you very much. I was wondering if you include uncertainties and reproduce errors in this energy estimation, and if so, how do you do it?
Okay, thank you, Adriana. It's a very important question. It's always important to have error bars on anything. Otherwise, it's very hard to claim anything for sure. And yes, we do produce uncertainty estimates. And if you want to look in detail, I refer you to that paper in Nature on the tropical forests. The work in Africa that I described towards the end is paper. There's a preprint out. There's work that's in review. But basically, the approach that we take is propagation of errors. So there's error involved in estimation of population densities. There's error involved in body mass, in the allometric relationships within body mass and energy expenditure. So you get each of those errors, and there's a simple, rigorous mathematics where you can propagate the errors of each of your bits of your calculation to calculate the error overall. And so we tend to use that propagation approach to estimate the uncertainty in our final numbers and the error bars that you would have seen in the figures.
Great, thank you so much. The next question is, do you think more energy flow is better generally, assume does not negatively affect the rare species?
Another great question. I think the second part, the assuming part, is really important. You can think of context where there's more energy flow, which is not better. You can think of a lake being eutrophied with an algal bloom. There might be more energy flow in that lake, but you're diminishing the functions of that lake, destroying an ecosystem, or a coral reef covered in algae as an example of that. So I think where energy flow is amplifying, but not substantially changing the composition of an ecosystem, altering it to a different ecosystem, then energy flow can be a measure perhaps of enhanced ecological function, enhanced ecological health. But where that energy flow, it goes alongside a complete transformation of that ecosystem to a different ecosystem or a deeply altered ecosystem, then I don't think that could be called enhanced ecological health. That's probably diminished ecological health. So it isn't just about rare species. I think it's more also just the general composition of an ecosystem and how much it's maintained or shifted by that amplified energy flow.
Great, thank you so much. Back to the question about the logged forest. Have you done analysis different the age of the logged forest and then to see whether you have reached the same conclusion? I guess you presented is the kind of pooled data from all kinds of logged forest. Is that right?
Yes. These study sites were just a few logged forests, similar history, but different degrees of intensity of logging. I think what I'd imagine is if you followed forests over 100 years or 150 years of chronosequence, you'd see an increase of energy flow and then a gradual decline back to old growth forest values, probably on the time scale of 100 years, I would guess. But it certainly depends on both the intensity of logging and the ecosystem, the reference ecosystem as well. But that's probably, trees are such long-lived organisms. It takes a system like that about 100 years to relax back to its original state. That may be different in other ecosystems that are more dynamic in terms of their response to disturbance.
Yeah, okay, great. So the next question is, what's the natural disturbance regime in the forest, and could logging mimic this natural regime?
I think that varies in tropical forests. These dipracarp forests probably have generally a very low disturbance regime, which is probably why these forests are the tallest forests in the tropics. There are no major windstorm events in this region. Sabah, this area of northern Borneo, means the land below the wind because it was below the big typhoon belts. It never gets major wind disturbance. And because it's more maritime, it doesn't get these big storm blowdowns that the Amazon or the Congo has. So I think in this case, logging isn't mimicking this regime, but disturbance can, in many cases, a mature low disturbance system can be a system with quite a lot of frozen energy, essentially locked up in the vegetation, lots of nutrients locked up in that system. And what disturbance, whether it's a natural disturbance or a other low to medium intensity disturbance, can do is release those nutrients, release that energy that then cascades through the ecosystem. So it's a slightly controversial way of thinking about ecosystems. We tend to think of climax, mature states as the goal of an ecosystem that we're trying to head to. But when we think about ecosystems more broadly, disturbance, it has an intrinsic role. It isn't a negative thing in many ecosystems. It's part of what shapes and the dynamism of many ecosystems. Systems such as savannas are obviously optimized for disturbance, but many other ecosystems can actually respond and adapt to disturbance and shape their ecological functions.
Great. The next question is, excellent talk, Dr. Malhi. I'm wondering if diseases of flora and fauna were taken into account for energetics modeling. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm not sure what that question is getting at, but the short answer is no, that we didn't have any disease calculations in there. If that's getting at what fraction of the population is lost to disease or pathogens, or what fraction of plant productivity is diminished, they may be factors in there, but they're not something that we looked at. We didn't really have the data to be able to look at that.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. This is very exciting and very stimulating. And we have more time, but we already run out of time. So we'll stop here. And thank you so much again for your fantastic talk. And also thanks so much for the audience for the active participation. So good evening and good night, good night, or have the nice day today, depend where you are. So thank you so much, everyone. Yeah.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah.